The wind came in low across the dunes, carrying with it the faint smell of salt and old pine. The morning was colorless, the kind of flat gray that made the shoreline look older than it was, as if time had pressed its weight against this place for too long. On the ridge above Breakwater Point, two figures stood in silence, their jackets pulled tight, their eyes fixed on the patch of sand that had been softly cordoned off. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. It felt more like a memory resurfacing than a discovery being made. One of the figures, an older woman with silver at her temples, leaned on a walking stick. Her breathing was steady, controlled, but her face held the weight of recognition. She had walked this stretch of coastline many times in her life, yet today felt different. As if something she had pushed down year after year had finally chosen to rise. The younger man beside her spoke quietly, almost unsure if his voice belonged in the moment. He explained that erosion had shifted the dune line again after the winter storms. Sand had been carried off in sheets, revealing pockets of the past. Among them was a small depression in the ground, a place where the wind seemed to hesitate before moving on. Workers had found fragments of fabric there, tangled roots holding it in place like fingers unwilling to let go. It was coarse, faded, and unmistakable to the woman who now stood over it. She bent slightly, studying the cloth without touching it. The morning breeze lifted the loose corner, making it flutter the way it once had when she first saw it decades ago. The pattern was almost gone now, but the texture remained. A blanket that had survived more years in silence than anyone in the town could admit. The younger man watched her expression shift, but she said nothing, keeping her eyes on the sand that surrounded it. Behind them, the coastline stretched in a long muted arc. Houses in the distance looked small, their windows flashing intermittently as the clouds shifted. The air carried a sense of unfinished conversation, as though the land itself were waiting for someone to acknowledge what had been buried beneath its surface. A third figure approached with careful steps. He carried a sealed evidence pouch, newly recovered from the lower dune, where winter tides had exposed a deeper layer. Inside the pouch was a single item, small enough that it could have been overlooked, the corner of another fabric fold, slightly darker, stiffened from age. The older woman blinked slowly at the sight of it. She didn't need to touch it to feel the weight it carried. The man explained that the area would be scanned again, this time with updated methods. He spoke of soil analysis, microfibers, and the possibility of securing enough preserved material for retesting. But his voice faded against the hum of the wind. The older woman heard only fragments, her thoughts drifting to the years when she had walked these dunes, searching for something she couldn't name. She had believed at the time that silence would dull the ache, but silence had simply given it room to grow. The younger man shifted his weight. He had been raised in Harbor's Rest and had known the story most of his life. Not the details, those had been kept quiet, but the shape of it, the way children in town learned early that some questions belonged to the sea. He glanced toward the old trail where the path met the sand, where hikers occasionally wandered by. Today it remained empty, almost respectfully so. The older woman inhaled deeply. The cold air steadied her. She had lived long enough to understand that certain truths were patient. They waited for the right moment, for the right eyes to notice what had always been there. She touched the top of her walking stick, grounding herself. "After so many years," she murmured, "I wasn't sure I'd ever see this again." No one replied. The moment seemed too fragile for answers. The evidence pouch was placed gently beside the first marker. The breeze lifted again, pulling fine grains of sand across the surface like a quiet veil. The woman watched the movement carefully, as though reading something in the pattern the wind left behind. Not Clue's memory. Some distance away, gulls circled overhead, their cries muted by the thick sky. The tide continued its slow rhythm, unconcerned with the human moment unfolding above it. Time had reshaped this coast repeatedly, yet somehow, impossibly, pieces of that first summer remained. Buried, preserved, waiting. The younger man asked if she wanted to leave, but she shook her head. Her eyes returned to the small depression where the blanket had lain for nearly half a century, held down by roots, sand, and silence. She thought of the person who had last touched it, the footsteps once imprinted here, the secrets carried away by the shifting ground. She stared at the horizon, letting the cold settle around her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. To understand how this began, we go back to 1976. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. In the spring of 1976, Harbor's Rest woke slowly each morning. The town was quiet before the summer crowds arrived, its narrow streets still swept clean by winter storms. Alina Marin lived in a small apartment above a print shop on Alder Lane, a place where the floorboards creaked and the windows let in more breeze than they kept out. She woke early, always before the sun, and sat for a moment at the edge of her bed listening to the distant hum of waves against Breakwater Point. Those few seconds before she moved felt like a ritual, a silent negotiation with the day ahead. She was 34, with a habit of tucking her hair behind her ear whenever she felt uncertain. She worked at the print shop downstairs, the kind of place that smelled faintly of paper pulp and ink. She liked her job more than she admitted. The repetition steadied her. She enjoyed the rhythm of the machines, the clean lines of freshly printed pages, the sense that she was helping bring someone else's message into the world, even if she wasn't brave enough to share her own. Her co-workers described her as quiet but kind, someone who listened more than she spoke. Elena had a way of noticing small details, the chipped edge of a ceramic mug, the loosened thread on a scarf, the way someone's voice softened when they talked about home. She collected these observations privately, the way others stored photographs. By the time customers entered the shop each morning, she had already set the workspace in order, paper trimmed, ink levels checked, envelopes stacked in neat rows. Organization gave her a sense of calm she rarely found elsewhere. In her apartment, she kept a small writing desk near the window overlooking the alley. The desk was old, its legs uneven, but she loved it. On it sat a thin stack of letters she had written over the years unsent, unaddressed, folded carefully as though one day they might find their intended destinations. Some were written to a mother she barely remembered, others to a sister she hadn't spoken to in months, and a few to no one in particular. They were confessions she didn't know how to say aloud, fragments of emotions she kept hidden because sharing them felt too vulnerable. When she wrote, she did so in longhand, the way she wished conversations could unfold, slowly, thoughtfully, without interruption. She wasn't afraid of being misunderstood. She was afraid of being dismissed. For her, the letters were a lifeline, a way to anchor herself when the world felt too restless. On Sundays, she walked to the shoreline. The dunes near Breakwater Point were her refuge. She loved the uneven paths, the roughness of the grasses that grew in patches, the shifts in the sand that made the landscape never quite the same from week to week. She often carried a faded cotton blanket with her, folding it neatly in her bag. When she reached a quiet spot, she would lay it down and sit for hours, watching the tide move in slow arcs, sketching lines and shapes in her notebook. She wasn't an artist, but the act of drawing helped her still her thoughts. Locals would sometimes see her from a distance, a lone figure seated in the dunes, hair gently lifted by the wind, notebook resting at her knees. To them she was simply part of the scenery, one of the quieter souls who lived at the edge of town. But to herself, those afternoons were moments of clarity, brief windows where she felt connected to something larger than routine, larger than fear. Her closest friend was a woman from the bakery across the street, a cheerful presence who always greeted Elena with warmth. The two shared morning conversations over coffee, exchanging small stories about work, weather, and whatever they had overheard around town. Elena rarely talked about her personal life, but she listened attentively to her friends' tales of family dinners, weekend plans, and dreams of someday leaving Harbor's Rest for a city with more lights and noise. Elena smiled at those stories, even though the thought of such a place overwhelmed her. When people asked about Elena's past, she answered gently but vaguely. She had grown up inland, moved from place to place, and never seemed to stay long. She had tried to build a home more than once, but something always came undone, circumstances shifting, people changing, routines breaking apart. Harbor's Rest was the first place where she felt she might stay longer than a season. She never said it outright, but the town represented a kind of stability she had longed for. That spring, she was not entirely alone. She had met someone the previous year, a man whose charm came in waves, sometimes warm, sometimes unpredictable. Calder Price was the sort of person who told stories with confidence and moved through the world, as if he could mold it to fit his desires. He brought excitement into her life at first, but over time she noticed the subtle shifts in his tone, the impatience in his eyes, the way he would speak for her in conversations. She tried to overlook it, convincing herself he was simply protective, simply passionate. But the unease grew quietly, threading itself through her days like a fine, persistent crack. Still, she wrote letters about him, letters she never sent. She wrote about wanting trust, about wanting a future where she didn't have to hide uncertainty beneath silence. She kept these letters folded in the same stack as the others. When she looked at them, she wondered whether they were messages of hope or warnings she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Her last ordinary day followed a familiar pattern. She woke early, listened to the ocean, and prepared for work. She nodded to the landlord on the stairs, straightened a stack of newspapers by the door, and unlocked the print shop. She mixed the inks, adjusted the rollers, and began the first printing run of the morning. She made coffee for her coworker, leaving a small note on his desk about a custom order someone had requested. It was a day like any other, so ordinary that its normalcy would later haunt those who knew her. During her lunch break, she took her notebook to the small bench behind the shop and sketched the outline of a dune she had visited the week before. The lines were light, unfinished. She paused halfway through, looking at something in the distance, though what it was, no one could ever say. When she closed the notebook, she wore an expression that suggested both determination and hesitation. That evening, she made a phone call to her sister. The conversation was brief. Lydia remembered the sound of the wind behind Elena's voice, remembered her saying she planned to take a walk the next day, maybe spend time near the dunes to clear her thoughts. Lydia asked whether everything was all right. Elena paused, then said she just needed space to think. There were no arguments, no accusations, no signs of distress, just the quiet cadence of two sisters navigating a familiar distance. When the call ended, Lydia had no reason to believe it would be their last conversation. The following morning, Elena left her apartment early, carrying her faded blanket folded neatly in her bag. She locked the door with a gentle click and stepped into the growing light of a spring day that looked no different from all the others. No one who saw her noticed anything strange, anything urgent. She walked calmly toward Breakwater Point, a place she trusted, a place where she believed silence could help her sort the pieces of her life. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. The last morning of Elena Marin's life began as quietly as any other. A thin layer of cloud drifted above Harbor's Rest, softening the light that filtered between the rooftops. At 6:12 a.m., she left her apartment, locking the door with her usual gentle turn, the faded cotton blanket folded neatly inside her canvas bag. She walked down Alder Lane at an unhurried pace, passing closed storefronts and the wooden railing by the bakery where her friend had taped a handwritten sign announcing early summer specials. She paused briefly, reading it, then continued toward the coast. Witnesses would later recall seeing her somewhere between 6:30 and 6:40. One remembered her standing near the seawall, brushing strands of hair behind her ear as she looked toward Breakwater Point. Another claimed she crossed Harbor Street near the fishermen's sheds, their nets hung in rows like sleeping shadows. None of these accounts were exact. None could confirm the minute, the exact expression on her face, or whether she walked alone the entire way. But all placed her heading toward the dunes, a direction she often chose when she wanted distance from the world. The path to the dunes twisted gently upward, marked by weather-faded posts and wild grasses that flickered in the morning breeze. The sand was cool beneath her shoes, shifting softly as she walked. She had traveled this route enough times to recognize the small dips where water collected after storms, the hollow beneath a crooked pine where she once sat sketching in the autumn light. That familiarity gave her comfort, even as her life felt increasingly uncertain. At 7:05 a.m., a groundskeeper working at the lookout point noticed a man in a light jacket standing near the trailhead. The man appeared restless, pacing occasionally, pausing often, scanning the dune line. The groundskeeper didn't recognize him and assumed he was a visitor. He did not know that this man had been seen around town the previous week, his presence quiet, but noticeable to those who paid attention. Nor did he know the two were connected. The man left the area shortly after, heading in the opposite direction of the shore. By 7:20, the town was waking. Bakery doors opened. Fishmongers shouted greetings across the wharf. A delivery truck rolled slowly along the main road. But on the dunes, everything remained still. The grasses moved in long, slow motions. The sand carried faint footprints, some fresh, some eroded by the wind, layered in complex patterns impossible to untangle. Sometime between 7:30 and 8:15, the critical events unfolded. Investigators would later reconstruct the likely sequence, not through witnesses but through the logic of terrain, the position of disturbed sand, and the orientation of the blanket found at the scene. Elena probably reached her usual resting area, a subtle plateau where the dunes opened into a shallow bowl sheltered from the harsher winds. The location was quiet even on busy summer days. She would have set her bag down, shaken out the blanket, and arranged it on the sand. Perhaps she intended to sketch, or simply sit in the silence she trusted. Nothing in the scene suggested she expected danger. Near the top of the slope, investigators later found a single broken shoe print, deeper on one side as if someone had paused, shifting weight forward. Sand had partially filled it, but its shape remained distinct enough to photograph. Below it, the sand showed signs of compression, subtle, uneven, and in places scuffed. What happened next left no eyewitness, only physical echoes. There was no sign of struggle in the traditional sense, no overturned objects, no sharp drag marks. Instead, the displacement was concentrated in small, inconsistent patches, as if movement had been abrupt rather than drawn out. The blanket had been repositioned, the corners uneven, suggesting it had not been left the way Elena would normally arrange it. A shallow indentation ran parallel to one edge, a trace that could have been a knee or elbow pressed briefly into the sand. A faint depression was discovered near the crest of the dune, slightly wider than a human footprint. Investigators debated its significance for years. Some believed someone had waited there, watching her approach. Others thought it was simply a patch of heavier sand left after the previous night's wind. What made the detail unsettling was how isolated it looked, as if it belonged to a person standing perfectly still. By 9 a.m., a fisherman named Hartley Weaver left the wharf, intending to walk the coastal trail before beginning his afternoon shift. He had done this for years, using the quiet morning to steady his thoughts. The tide was low, exposing long stretches of wet sand. The sky had begun to clear, thin sunlight reflecting off the water. As he approached Breakwater Point, he noticed the edges of a blanket in the distance, the fabric lifting and settling in the wind like something breathing slowly. Weaver continued walking, assuming someone was resting nearby. But when he reached the incline leading to the dunes and no figure appeared beside the spread blanket, unease settled in. The blanket's color was faded, pale blue and cream, its corners partially buried. A single canvas bag lay next to it, upright, unrifled. Weaver called out once. The sound carried, but met only the steady hush of the sea. He stepped closer, his boots sinking slightly into the sand. He hesitated before touching anything, his instincts telling him something was wrong, though he couldn't say why. He radioed for assistance at 9:26 a.m. When the first responders arrived, They approached the area with measured steps. They noted the blanket's condition, the indentation beneath it, and the strange stillness of the surrounding sand. They found no immediate sign of Elena, no footprints leading toward the water, no trail suggesting she had walked away. The dunes were bare, except for the faint marks left earlier in the morning. Her sketchbook was still inside the bag, pages unmarked. Her jacket was folded neatly beneath it. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place except her. Detective Maren Holt arrived shortly after 10 a.m. She had been with the department for less than a decade at the time, but had built a reputation for quiet attentiveness. She knelt near the blanket, examining the folds, touching only the areas least disturbed by the morning wind. She noticed the unevenness immediately. Someone else had been here. She could sense it not from dramatic signs but from small inconsistencies. Sand brushed in unnatural directions, the faint outline of a palm pressed and then lifted. She circled the immediate area slowly, cataloging the smallest anomalies. A cluster of broken grass stems, a spot where the sand had been compressed as if by someone kneeling, and the single broken shoe print on the slope above clear enough to suggest weight, angled enough to imply intent. The indentation at the crest troubled her most. It was neither footprint nor animal track, but something in between, too broad, too shallow, too solitary. She could not determine how old it was, only that it looked like a place where a person might have stood for a long time, waiting. By noon, officers had begun searching the surrounding dunes. They fanned out across Breakwater Point, marking areas with flags and taking notes on their clipboards. The wind grew stronger, erasing details almost as quickly as they were found. The footprints closest to the water faded within minutes. The air felt charged, not with drama, but with the quiet urgency of something unresolved. By mid-afternoon, search teams combed through the nearby coves, marsh edges, and narrow inlets. The tide reached farther up the shore, reclaiming the sand. No new evidence appeared. Not a strand of hair, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. It was as if Alana had walked into the dunes and dissolved into the landscape. The search continued into the evening. Lamps were set up at the base of the trail, casting long shadows across the drying sand. Fishermen returning from their routes lowered their voices as they passed, sensing the seriousness of the scene. Locals gathered near the road, whispering worries to each other. Harbor's Rest had seen hardship before, but this felt different. It felt personal, as though silence itself had swallowed a life. Maren stayed long after most officers left. She stood on the slope above the blanket, studying the horizon as the sky dimmed to violet. She replayed the morning in her mind, the broken shoe print, the disturbed sand, the indentation where someone might have waited. These fragments formed not a story, but the outline of one, its details missing, its meaning unclear. Near the edge of the plateau, just beyond the disturbed area, she found one last detail, a small section of sand pressed into a narrow oval, difficult to see unless viewed from the right angle. It wasn't a footprint. It wasn't from an animal. It was too precise, too deliberate. It looked like the imprint of a hand, not fully, not cleanly. Just the faint arc of pressure where fingers once pushed into the sand, perhaps to brace, perhaps to rise, perhaps to reach. The wind had nearly erased it. Another hour and it would have been gone entirely. Maren called another officer over to document it. As they moved to record the mark, the wind shifted again, scattering a thin veil of sand across the surface. The imprint blurred instantly, its edges softening, its meaning dissolving into uncertainty. She understood then that whatever had happened on the dunes that morning had been concealed not by carelessness, but by nature itself. The landscape had swallowed the truth as it often did, quietly, thoroughly, without intention. The hand-shaped impression remained the most haunting part of the scene. Too faint to confirm, too distinct to ignore. It would remain one of the unresolved clues in the case for decades, the kind of detail investigators returned to again and again, wondering if they had misread it entirely. or if it had been the closest anyone had come to understanding what really happened between 7:30 and 8:15 that morning. In the first week after Elena Marin's disappearance, the police station in Harbor's Rest was filled with steady movement and tight voices. Reports came in from nearby towns, people claiming they had seen someone matching her description. Most of the calls led nowhere. A woman with a similar hairstyle boarding a bus in Redwick. Someone buying sketch paper in a craft store 6 towns away. A man insisting she had been in his diner 2 nights earlier, only to admit later that he might have confused her with a summer customer from the previous year. Each lead added urgency, then dissolved into uncertainty, leaving investigators with the same blank spaces they began with. Detective Marin Holt made daily visits to the dunes during those early days, hoping the sea might offer something it had withheld. She walked the paths again and again, studying the pattern of grasses, the shifting depressions in the sand, the way the wind erased the contours of the morning's footprints. Her colleagues urged her to rest, but she couldn't. Something about the quietness of the scene unsettled her. It felt deliberate, yet fragile, as though the truth had been placed just out of reach. By the second week, the investigation expanded inland. Calder Price was located in a rented room above a bait shop near the interstate. Officers interviewed him, asking about his last moments with Elena, about whether she had mentioned plans to leave town. Calder spoke confidently at first, claiming he had urged her to seek help for stress, that she often wandered off on her own. But something in his manner alerted Marin, a slight delay before answering, his gaze never settling, his voice too calm when recounting the moment he realized she hadn't returned. Still, nothing tied him directly to her disappearance. He carried no marks of struggle, had no unusual scratches, showed no sign of panic. He offered names of people who could confirm he was at the motel during the critical hours, though these witnesses remembered only vaguely. One said he might have been there. Hard to say, another shrugged. With nothing substantial, they let him go. A week later, Calder left town. The following months dragged on. Sheriff's deputies searched the marshlands and forest paths. Divers examined narrow inlets along the coast. Flyers were distributed across the county, each bearing a photo of Elena with gentle eyes and hair pulled behind her ear. Locals volunteered for search parties. Some brought their dogs. Others brought covered baskets of food for the officers. Harbor's Rest had always been a small town, but in those days, it felt even smaller, as if the disappearance had shrunk the place inward. As summer turned to fall, the case grew colder. Rumors began spreading, some benign, others darker. People whispered about strangers passing through town, about a transient man seen near the dunes, about a woman fitting Elena's description entering a rusted blue pickup that no one could later identify. A few insisted she had run away from her life, claiming she had been unhappy for weeks. Others argued she would never leave without telling someone. Lydia Marin, her sister, visited the station every month. She sat across from Marin, tapping her fingers nervously against her knee. "Can you check with the hospitals again?" she asked in September. "What about shelters or bus stations?" She carried a small envelope each time, as if she couldn't arrive without holding something. In the beginning, those envelopes contained photographs or letters Elena had written years earlier. Later, they held nothing at all, just blank paper she tore into thin strips as she spoke. "We'll keep searching," Marin told her. But even as she said it, she knew the town was losing ground. Too much time had already passed. Then the dead-end leads began. A hiker reported seeing bones near the West Bluff 2 weeks before Elena vanished. When officers searched the area, they found nothing. A traveling carnival worker claimed a man had bragged about hurting a woman near the coast. Investigators tracked down the carnival, only to learn the man wasn't real or had used a false name. A fisherman insisted a small boat had been abandoned offshore on the morning Elena disappeared. Records later showed it had belonged to a seasonal visitor who simply forgot to tie it down. By winter, the case file had grown thick, stacked with notes, maps, and interview transcripts. but the substance of it remained thin. No blood, no clothing, no objects left behind except the blanket, the bag, the unmarked sketchbook. Everything else was absent. The following spring, a partial breakthrough came when a drifter was arrested in a nearby county for assault. He matched the vague description of the man seen pacing near the dunes on the morning Elena vanished. For a moment, detectives shared a quiet sense of possibility. They brought him in for questioning. He denied ever being in Harbor's Rest. His shoes didn't match the print found at the scene. His alibi, while imprecise, was verified by a mechanic who remembered him from the shop that day. The hope dissolved by evening. Another lead emerged 2 years later when a woman reported that her ex-husband had confessed to hurting someone on a beach years ago. The ex-husband denied it. Their divorce had been bitter. Her credibility faltered when she changed her story twice. Officers searched his property, but no evidence tied him to Elena. He owned no light jackets, had never been recorded in Harbor's Rest, and had no connection to Calder. Yet another man confessed while incarcerated in another state. His story was detailed but inconsistent, changing each time he told it. Investigators checked his timeline. He had been in a different part of the country that month. By the mid-1980s, the case had slipped into a slow procedural rhythm: annual reviews, occasional interviews with townspeople, rechecking of stored evidence. At each review, Marin sat at the long table, flipping through the pages she had memorized. She studied the photographs of the blanket, the sand patterns, the faint indentations. Each year, she felt more distance between herself and the moment she first stood on that dune, filled with the sense that something waited beneath the surface. Journalists visited the station a few times. Small-town disappearances drew attention in cycles. One reporter asked, "Do you think she's still alive somewhere?" Marin answered, "We don't rule out anything," though she no longer believed that. Another asked if Calder remained a person of interest. "We can't elaborate on individuals," the department replied. In truth, they had lost track of him. Records showed he moved twice, changed jobs, traveled often. Then his trail grew cold. Lydia continued writing letters addressed to Elena, keeping them in a small wooden box in her home. She mailed some of them, hoping they might reach a shelter or a friend or somewhere she couldn't imagine. As the years passed, she mailed fewer and kept more inside the box. When she visited the station, her conversations with detectives grew shorter. "I think she would have called," she said once. Marin nodded. "I know." The late 80s brought another wave of false leads. A woman in a distant city claimed her neighbor resembled Elena. Officers traveled there, only to discover the resemblance was superficial. In 1989, a private investigator hired by a distant relative came forward with a theory that Elena had assumed a new identity. His theory collapsed within a week. Friends and co-workers from the print shop insisted she had no reason to vanish by choice. During one review session, a young officer suggested the indentation found near the crest of the dune had been misinterpreted. He believed it was simply a weather imprint. Marin disagreed, but she no longer had the evidence to prove it. The original photograph had faded, and the casting they attempted had been too shallow. The hand-shaped impression remained one of the most divisive elements in the case file. By the early 90s, activity slowed dramatically. New detectives inherited the file, reviewing it as part of their training. They highlighted potential leads, then struck them out after a few days of review. Priorities shifted to active cases. The Marin file gathered dust on the third shelf, wrapped in a rubber band that had hardened with time. In the late 90s, Lydia visited for what would be the last time. She sat across from Marin, who had aged visibly since they first met. Lines deepened around her eyes, hair more silver than brown. Lydia placed the wooden box of letters on the desk. "Could you hold on to these?" she asked. "Just in case someone needs them someday." Marin opened the box and saw the letters stacked neatly, each folded with care. Some were stained from years of handling. Others were crisp as if written only yesterday. She nodded slowly. "I'll keep them safe." Lydia smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. She left without asking the usual questions. The Maine file was officially archived 2 years later. There was no ceremony, no final statement. Just a form signed and placed inside the existing stack, marking the case as inactive pending new evidence. The box was moved to a lower shelf in the storage room. For a long while, no one touched it. The town learned to speak of Elena less frequently. Her name became something whispered to newcomers, told in fragments. The dunes remained unchanged to the untrained eye, but for those who remembered, the wind carried a faint echo of a story without an ending. It would be decades before anyone opened the Maine file again. And when they did, the answers that emerged would be nothing like the theories that had once filled those fading pages. The years after Elena's disappearance unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly, like tidewater creeping up a shore no one was watching. Time did not move forward so much as it drifted sideways, collecting moments and discarding them with equal indifference. In the beginning, everything in Lydia Maine's life centered around her sister's absence. The phone stayed plugged in beside her bed. A notepad sat by the kitchen sink, ready for any detail she might need to relay to the police. A stack of envelopes grew on her table, each addressed to a different hospital, shelter, or stranger who might have seen someone with soft eyes and gentle hands. But silence has its own erosion. Months turned to seasons, and seasons slipped into years, each one smoothing the sharp edges of urgency into something softer, heavier, and harder to carry. Lydia stayed in Redwood County during those early years, living in the same house she and Elena once shared in their early 20s. It was a small one-story home with fading paint and a yard overrun by dandelions, the kind of place where time left its mark in quiet ways. She hung onto their shared belongings: a chipped mug, the blanket they used during childhood storms, a photograph of Elena at 17 with sunlight caught in her eyelashes. These objects slowly became anchors, both comforting and unbearable. Every birthday, Lydia wrote a new letter, even after hope dimmed. She wrote about the weather, about small-town gossip, about the new bakery that had opened on Cedar Street. She wrote apologies for moments she regretted, dreams she wished she had shared, and memories she replayed to keep Elena near. She folded each letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and placed it inside the wooden box. By the 10th anniversary, the box was full. In Harbor's Rest, people remembered Elena differently. The older residents told newcomers that she was a gentle soul who loved the dunes. Others remembered her as the woman who vanished quietly, without a trace, becoming part of the coastline's folklore. Children who grew up in the 80s heard her name whispered like a cautionary tale. Some believed she had walked into the sea. Others believed she had been taken by someone passing through town. The truth was less dramatic but more haunting. She had simply disappeared in plain sight. Detective Maren Holt aged alongside the unanswered case. Her hair silvered, her steps slowed, but her memory remained sharp. The Maine file stayed near her desk for years, even when new officers took over and priorities shifted. She kept the wooden box of letters Lydia entrusted to her on the shelf beside old case binders. Sometimes she reread them, letting the looping handwriting and heartfelt words pull her back into the story she never managed to finish. Each letter felt like a thread from a life left suspended. By the 90s, change swept across Harbor's Rest. Houses were renovated. The print shop closed, replaced by a small cafe with polished counters and bright lights. Alder Lane no longer carried the scent of ink and paper. The dunes remained mostly the same, though steadfast, shifting quietly under the elements, refusing to surrender secrets. Lydia moved twice in the following years. The first move was out of necessity. Her job relocated, and she needed to save money. The second was to create distance from the past. She packed Elena's belongings into 2 boxes, sealing them with worn tape. She did not open those boxes for a decade. She rented a small apartment in a neighboring city, with tall windows and a view of traffic instead of trees. Some mornings she woke and forgot the shape of her sister's voice. On others, it echoed so suddenly and clearly she had to sit down and breathe. In 1999, Lydia received a letter from a freelance journalist researching unsolved disappearances in New England. He had found an article about the Maine case from the early 80s and wondered whether she might be willing to speak. She agreed, hoping the new attention might stir something. The interview was long and emotional. She showed him photographs, read him excerpts from her letters, pointed to a fading newspaper clipping she had kept taped in her mirror for years. The journalist published the story 6 months later. For a brief moment, hope flickered. A few people called the hotline with information. None of it held. One caller insisted she had traveled with Elena to another state under a false name. A man claimed he had seen her in a shelter years earlier. Each tip dissolved under scrutiny, leaving Lydia with the same hollow ache. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had begun making headlines. Cases once considered unsolvable were suddenly reopened. Families found closure decades after loss. Lydia followed each news segment obsessively, marking down techniques she didn't fully understand. She wondered whether DNA could be drawn from the old blanket or from fibers she had never seen. She wondered whether Elena's case might someday join the list of reopened investigations. She visited the Harbor's Rest police station in 2004, meeting a younger detective who had inherited the Maine file. He examined the documents respectfully, but said the technology wasn't quite there yet for such degraded materials. He made no promises. Lydia appreciated his honesty, but left with the familiar weight pressing against her ribs. Time continued its patient work. The years softened some memories and sharpened others. Old friends drifted away. Birthdays turned into quiet rituals. Lydia stopped writing letters for a while, convinced she had said everything she needed to say. But one evening in 2010, while cleaning a drawer, she found a sketch Elena had made. The dunes drawn with simple lines, the curve of the shoreline, a single figure sitting with her back to the viewer. Lydia wept for the first time in years, the kind of release that felt both cleansing and painful. She took out a pen and wrote a new letter, placing it carefully on top of the others. Meanwhile, in Harbor's Rest, the dunes shifted again. Storms pulled at their edges, reshaping their curves, exposing thin layers of sand that had not seen sunlight for decades. Hikers occasionally found small objects washed ashore: broken shells, sea glass, corroded metal. None of it related to Elena, but each discovery reminded the town that the past, however buried, had a way of resurfacing. Marin retired in 2002, but continued to visit the station occasionally. She asked about updates, though she rarely expected any. She kept the wooden box of letters on her bookshelf at home, unwilling to hand it off to anyone else. In quiet moments, she read the earliest notes from Lydia, marveling at how hope and grief intertwined across the years. In 2015, she attended a seminar on advancements in forensic genealogy. She listened carefully, leaning forward in her seat as experts explained how even degraded biological material could lead to distant family matches. She realized that the Marin file had not simply stagnated, it had been waiting for the right era. On the drive home, she felt something shift inside her, a stirring she hadn't experienced since the early days of the investigation. A thought repeated itself in her mind. Maybe the technology had finally caught up to the truth, but she didn't reopen the file. Not yet. She let the idea settle, returning to it over and over as the years wound on. By 2020, the world had changed dramatically. The town felt different. New people lived in the old houses. The cafe on Alder Lane had expanded. The dunes looked both familiar and strange after years of erosion and restoration projects. Marin walked the trail again one winter afternoon, her breath visible in the cold air. She looked down at her feet, at the sand shifting beneath her shoes, and thought of Elena, how small her world had been before she vanished, how large the absence she left behind. Lydia, now older, lived in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. She had softened with age, her hair silver like Marin's, her hands thinner. Every so often, she would open the boxes she had sealed years earlier, inhaling the faint scent of old paper and sunlight preserved in fabric fibers. She did not expect answers anymore, but she still believed her sister's story mattered. And then it happened, unexpectedly and without fanfare. In early 2021, Marin returned to the police archive to donate old notes for digitization. She opened the Marin box for the first time in years. The blanket, still coarse and pale, lay inside its evidence sleeve. The letters from Lydia remained neatly stacked. The room was quiet, the air cool, dust drifting lazily through beams of light. A young forensic liaison noticed the blanket and asked whether it had ever undergone next-generation sequencing. Marin shook her head. The technology had been too primitive before. The liaison smiled gently. "We can try again. There's better equipment now." For the first time in 45 years, hope stirred again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet persistence that had defined Elena's entire story. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. For nearly half a century, the evidence from the dunes rested in archive boxes, their contents unchanged while the world around them transformed. In early 2021, when the box labeled Marin case was carried across the cold tiles of the harbor's rest annex, no one expected anything remarkable. The blanket inside had yellowed at the edges. Its weave felt stiff under the thin plastic. It had survived storms, storage transfers, and years of disinterest. Yet despite its age, it still held on to something invisible. Something time had failed to erase. The discovery began quietly. A young forensic liaison, trained in next-generation sequencing, saw the blanket and paused. The fabric's coarse texture caught the light in a way that suggested depth within its fibers, as though tiny shadows hid between the threads. She asked a simple question, whether it had ever undergone more modern analysis. When she learned it hadn't, she wrapped it carefully and logged it for transport to the state's forensic laboratory. There was nothing dramatic about that moment. It was not accompanied by raised voices or sudden revelations. It was an act of modest curiosity, a belief that even old evidence might still carry a spark of truth. At the Marrowbrook Forensic Lab, the blanket was placed beneath a dome of bright white light. The technicians moved slowly, touching only what was necessary. They photographed every corner, every frayed edge, every discoloration. Tools were smaller now, more precise than those used decades earlier. The blanket was scanned with a high-resolution microscope capable of reading the tiniest contours, searching for biological material preserved by the structure of the weave. Small particles glimmered under the magnification. Some were sand remnants, still clinging after all these years. Some were fibers from clothing that brushed against the fabric. And deep within a coil, no wider than a strand of hair, lay a cluster of keratinized cells. They were old, fragile, and broken down by time, but not yet lost. The extraction took hours. Technicians used micro-aspiration tools to remove the cells from the recesses of the blanket without damaging them. They treated the fragments with enzymatic repair kits, designed for severely degraded DNA, coaxing genetic information out of molecular wounds. A sequencer whirred steadily, interpreting the faint signals as they emerged. The first usable peaks appeared shortly after 3 in the morning. The lab was nearly silent at that hour, with only the hum of machines and the faint shuffle of the night technician moving from one terminal to another. She leaned over the screen, eyes widening as she recognized the signatures of a partial autosomal pattern. It wasn't perfect. Much of it was damaged beyond retrieval, but enough remained for genealogical analysis. She saved the data, labeled it carefully, and began the upload to a database that could compare the genome to publicly accessible DNA markers. Modern forensic genealogy relied not on finding an exact match, but on finding distant relatives whose DNA could triangulate ancestry. Over the next several days, the system calculated probabilities, traced lineage branches, and generated potential family groups. Each cluster of matches formed a small constellation of shared markers. Some were too faint to matter. But one group, originating from Redwick County, grew more defined with each analytic pass. The name Marin emerged through census records, birth certificates, and a decades-old obituary. Combined with mitochondrial lineage markers, the database produced a result with overwhelming probability. The profile belonged to a family with one missing member, a woman last documented in 1976. Her name was Elena. The confirmation was sent to the Harbor's Rest Station, where retired Detective Marin Holt had been visiting for unrelated archival work. A young officer approached her with the printed results. The paper shook slightly as he handed it to her. Marin read the name slowly, her lips parting as something long buried inside her rose to the surface. Elena Marin, confirmed after 45 years. She closed her eyes and let the weight of that fact settle. The dunes had held their silence for decades, but now the silence cracked, revealing a name that had once been spoken with such familiar tenderness. The new information revived the file overnight. The box was brought to an investigative room and spread across the table. Photographs, maps, transcripts, the wooden box of letters Lydia had entrusted years ago. Detectives began comparing the DNA results with old notes, re-examining witness accounts and assembly of the timeline. For the first time in decades, the case breathed. The DNA analysis did not only identify Elena, it held another surprise. Technicians discovered faint male trace DNA embedded in the blanket, damaged but still capable of indicating genetic lineage. It did not belong to Calder Price, as some might have assumed. Calder's profile had been obtained through archived materials years earlier during an unrelated inquiry. This trace sample, though incomplete, shared markers consistent with another member of his family. Initial calculations pointed toward a male relative, a nephew, a cousin, or perhaps a younger sibling. When genealogical reconstruction finished, the strongest match aligned with someone who had once lived with Calder for a brief period. His younger brother, Rowan Price, a man who had vanished from state records in the late 1970s. The revelation reframed everything. Investigators pulled Rowan's old employment records, tracking his movements through scattered jobs in neighboring towns. Several lined up with Calder's known locations during that year. Rowan had been seen traveling with him during the spring of 1976, the same months Elena moved to Harbor's Rest. A motel ledger from that time showed two male signatures with similar handwriting traits. A clerk from another town recalled a man with sharp features who rarely spoke, accompanying someone matching Calder's description. The pieces fit together with an unsettling elegance. Calder was no longer viewed as a controlling partner alone. He had help, or at least another figure present during those months. The faint hand impression found in the dunes years earlier took on new meaning. It was no longer simply an ambiguous indentation. It might have belonged to the second man. Before releasing the findings publicly, investigators contacted Lydia. She sat in the small living room of her home, hands resting in her lap, listening as detectives explained the sequencing process, the genealogical triangulation, and how the DNA had been protected by the coarse texture of the blanket. When they revealed her sister's identity had finally been confirmed, Lydia lowered her head. For a long time she said nothing. Then she whispered a single sentence, "Thank you for not giving up on her." The knowledge that another person besides Calder had been involved unsettled her, but it also answered questions that had lingered painfully in her mind. She had always felt that her sister's disappearance carried an element of force, something larger than a moment of impulsive violence. Now the evidence supported that intuition. When the findings were released to the town, the reaction came in waves. Longtime residents stood in small groups outside the post office, speaking softly. Younger residents who had grown up hearing fragments of the story felt shock ripple through their routines. Some brought flowers to the dunes, placing them near the trail. Others walked quietly along the path, pausing near the places they imagined Elena must have stood. Forensic genealogy had given the town something many believed was lost forever: certainty. Marin visited the dunes alone one evening, holding the printed results in her hands. The sand shifted under her feet as she walked to the small plateau where the blanket had once been found. She touched the wind-swept ground, feeling the invisible thread that now connected past and present. For decades, the case had rested in darkness, defined by absence. But the breakthrough illuminated everything, not with dramatic triumph, but with the quiet, persistent truth that science could restore what time had stolen. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. In the weeks following the DNA breakthrough, investigators in Harbor's Rest worked with a level of focus they had not experienced in decades. The discovery that Alina had been accompanied by not one but two men in the months leading to her disappearance changed the entire structure of the case. The name Rowan Price surfaced repeatedly as they reviewed archive materials. Employment records placed him near Calder during the spring of 1976. Motel ledgers showed handwriting similarities. And older interviews, once dismissed as vague, now took on new meaning when re-examined under the light of genetic evidence. The problem, however, was time. Rowan Price had vanished from all state databases after 1978. No tax returns, no licenses, no arrests, no forwarding addresses. Old roommates recalled he'd mentioned traveling west, following seasonal work in remote counties. That trail, too, went cold decades earlier. Investigators reached out to departments across multiple states, searching for any sign of him. Some records suggested a man with his name had been seen in rural areas, drifting from job to job. None could be confirmed. Calder's trail was only slightly clearer. He had bounced between jobs after leaving Harbor's Rest mechanic, farmhand, night clerk. A death certificate surfaced in a small out-of-state county, listing him as deceased since 1994. There was no surviving spouse. His belongings had been auctioned or discarded. He had died quietly, without leaving much of a trace. Despite the lack of living suspects, the investigation pressed forward. The goal was not arrest now, it was truth. The department prepared a comprehensive report to establish culpability and restore Alana's narrative. Investigators constructed a timeline, comparing DNA findings to witness accounts, travel records, and the sparse documents recovered from both brothers' histories. The picture that emerged was unsettling but coherent. Calder had been the controlling presence in Alana's life. Rowan, the quieter shadow behind him. Their movements overlapped in every recorded place from March to June 1976. The genealogical match linking Rowan to the blanket suggested proximity during the final hours of Alana's life. It was enough to support a charge of complicity, perhaps even direct involvement, had he been alive to face it. The department consulted the district attorney, who agreed that both men would have been indicted for kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and homicide. Though neither could stand trial, the findings warranted a formal review for judicial acknowledgement. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. Some families found closure this way, when justice could not unfold in the traditional sense. A small hearing was scheduled. Not a trial, but a legal session to present the reconstructed evidence before a judge, ensuring the outcome would be part of the public record. Lydia attended, sitting quietly in the middle row of the wood-paneled courtroom. The light from the tall windows settled gently across the benches, casting soft gold across the grain of the wooden floor. When the hearing began, the room seemed to hold its breath. Investigators read the sequence of events aloud with careful precision. They described how the blanket had preserved microscopic materials, how advances in DNA sequencing revealed Alana's identity, and how the secondary male profile linked Rowan to the scene. They explained the timeline, the brothers' presence in town, their abrupt departure, their history of moving quickly from one area to another. Each detail was delivered in a measured tone, respecting both the court and the weight of the story. Lydia listened with her hands clasped in her lap. She heard dates she remembered, names she had tried to forget, and moments that still lived sharply in her memory. For her, it was not just a case. It was a map of the years she had spent searching, grieving, and waiting for a voice to break the silence. The judge asked a few questions, clarifications about the DNA probability thresholds, the likelihood of another male relative, and the timeline of Calder's documented presence in Harbor's Rest. The answers were thorough. The evidence intertwined into a single, undeniable narrative. Calder and Rowan Price had been responsible for Elena's disappearance and death. Their involvement was not speculation. It was supported by genetics, timing, and circumstance. Though neither man could be handcuffed or questioned, the judge prepared a formal statement for the public record. He declared that had they been alive, prosecutors would have proceeded with charges supported by substantial evidence. Their deaths prevented traditional justice, but the truth had been restored. When the judge finished reading, a quiet stillness filled the room. Lydia brought a hand to her mouth, not in shock, but in a small, trembling exhale of relief. After decades of unanswered questions, after nights filled with imagined scenarios, her sister's story had finally reached clarity. It was not the ending she once prayed for, but it was the truth. And the truth carried a weight strong enough to anchor the years she had spent drifting in uncertainty. After the hearing, reporters gathered outside the courthouse. Their voices floated in small clusters across the steps, asking about forensic genealogy, about the Price brothers, about how the case had persisted for so long without resolution. Most of the questions were directed toward the investigators. Lydia remained on the side, leaning lightly on the railing. One reporter approached gently, asking what the verdict meant to her. Lydia paused before answering, choosing her words with care. "It means she wasn't alone," she said. "She mattered enough for people to keep looking. And now she's home in the way she could be." Her voice carried a sincerity that made the reporter lower his notepad for a moment, listening instead of recording. Detective Maren Holt stood nearby, watching Lydia with a quiet pride. She had spent most of her career shadowed by the Maren file, believing closure might never come. Now, seeing Lydia's shoulders ease and her eyes soften, she felt something settle inside her, a long-delayed breath finally released. In the days that followed, the community revisited Elena's story with renewed compassion. Flowers appeared along the Breakwater Point Trail, placed not out of morbid curiosity, but as small gestures of acknowledgement. Residents walked the dunes with a new awareness, pausing by the area where the blanket had once been found, imagining her there in the early morning light. A plaque was commissioned and installed near the lookout point. It bore Elena's name, her birth year, and a simple inscription: "May the truth endure, even in silence." People stopped to read it as they passed, some leaving tokens, smooth stones, dried flowers, handwritten notes. They were small tributes, but meaningful. Lydia visited the dunes a week after the hearing. She stood at the ridge overlooking the place where her sister spent her last morning alive. The wind pushed softly against her hair, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. She knelt and placed a folded letter, a new one, on the sand. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine Elena sitting here again, sketchbook in her lap, looking out at the shifting tide. The image was bittersweet, but no longer unbearable. She whispered goodbye, not as an ending, but as the closing of a long open story. Maren joined her later, walking slowly up the path with the wooden box of letters in her hands. She offered it to Lydia, who hesitated before accepting it. The box was heavier than she remembered, filled not just with paper, but with decades of longing and resilience. She held it to her chest, grateful for both its weight and its release. Together, they stood in silence, watching the horizon. The dunes shifted slightly beneath the breeze, the sand lifting in thin layers before settling again. It was the same landscape that had once swallowed the truth, yet now it carried a sense of calm. The silence that had once concealed a life now felt like a space held open for remembrance. Justice had not arrived through a dramatic arrest or a courtroom confrontation. It had arrived through persistence, science, memory, and the quiet belief that some stories refuse to disappear. For Elena, the truth had returned. And for those who had loved her, It was enough. In the months after the truth became part of the public record, Harbor's Rest settled into a new rhythm. The story that had once hovered at the edge of memory now found its place among the town's quiet landmarks. The dunes no longer felt like a question left hanging in the wind. They felt like the ending to a chapter that had waited too long to be written. Lydia returned more frequently, not with urgency, but with a sense of gentle purpose. She walked the trail her sister once loved, pausing at the places where Elena used to sit and watch the tide. The sand shifted beneath her feet the same way it had for decades, but it no longer carried the weight of uncertainty. It carried recognition. It carried the knowledge that Elena's final moments had not vanished entirely into silence. They had been brought back into the light with patience, persistence, and the strange grace of science. The wooden box of letters now rested on a shelf in Lydia's living room. She opened it from time to time, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. The letters no longer felt like messages to the missing. They felt like a testament to the endurance of love words written across decades, preserved by hands that refused to let time win. She added one last letter to the box, thanking her sister for the years they had shared and the years she had spent searching. Detective Marin Holt found her own kind of peace. She visited the dunes one last time that year, letting the wind push gently at her coat. She didn't carry case files or old photographs. She didn't replay the questions that had haunted her career. She simply stood at the ridge overlooking the plateau and breathed. The silence no longer felt accusatory. It felt like something released. In the center of town, the small plaque bearing Elena's name became a quiet gathering point. Locals placed flowers there without ceremony. Travelers paused out of curiosity, reading the inscription before moving on with a newfound respect for the place. Schools taught the case as part of a lesson on history and community. Her story, once fragmented and buried, became a reminder that every life leaves an imprint, sometimes faint, sometimes nearly erased, but always worth finding. The dunes themselves carried the strongest echoes of change. After storms, when the sand slid down the slopes in soft sheets, sunlight would catch the grains in a way that made the whole landscape shimmer. It was easy, in those moments, to believe the past was brushing against the present. The blanket, the footprints, the hand-shaped indentation, every clue once swallowed by time now felt like part of a broader arc, one that ended not in disappearance but in restoration. People in Harbor's Rest began walking the trail with a different awareness. They spoke Elena's name aloud, keeping it part of the living world. Some brought sketchbooks to the dunes, leaving simple drawings tucked under stones for the wind to carry. Others brought letters of their own notes to lost friends, to quiet regrets, to memories they wanted preserved. The dunes became a place where silence no longer hid the truth, but held it gently. The legacy of Elena's case stretched beyond the coastline. Families in surrounding towns learned about forensic genealogy, discovering in her story a reason to hope for their own unanswered questions. Investigators saw in the case a reminder that even a single preserved thread, a cardigan fiber, a fragment of fabric, could change everything when time and technology finally aligned. In the end, justice came not from punishment, but from recognition. It came from giving a name back to someone who had been reduced to a mystery. It came from honoring a life interrupted, and from refusing to let silence become the final witness. As Lydia stood on the ridge one evening, watching the sun sink behind the dunes, she felt something close gently inside her. Not an ending, but a soft completion. The wind brushed across her cheek, carrying the quiet, familiar rhythm of the ocean. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth settle. Her sister's story had found its way home. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.